we are in a very serious moment of crisis. What needs to happen for Ukraine not to be thrown under the bus and for Ukraine to give us Europeans the best chance of preserving our European Union or indeed our lifestyles and values in this part of the world?
Well, very important question indeed, and I do not really see any signals that we are anywhere close to the peace deal. And I think ultimately the main point for Ukraine is to preserve its sovereignty and to remain for Ukraine to remain an independent sovereign state that has the ability to choose its own future. And I think the territorial question is a crucial one here, because obviously Russia wants to see Ukraine weakened, and I do not see at any point Russia stopping its ambitions when it comes to invading further and trying to basically absorb Ukraine as a sovereign nation. So I think Europe's choices are quite limited in this case because US is leading this peace effort, but it is crucial to stand by Ukraine and to ensure that there are solid security guarantees in place that would involve preventing Russia to further continue invasion of Ukraine.
Do you think it is premature, to put it mildly, to talk about fast-track membership of Ukraine in the European Union when that Ukraine, might look very diminished at the end of this process and might be reduced to a Russian vassal state? And would the Russians agree to that? Because they basically think the European Union, when we get that far down the line, might not be a club worth joining anyway.
Well, Russians seem a little bit less pretentious when it comes to Ukraine's European membership in comparison to NATO membership, for instance. But 2027 is a very ambitious plan, to be honest. And we know that there are a lot of reforms, a lot of things that Ukraine needs to do to meet the criteria of EU membership. I think it is possible to accelerate the process. And we have already been seeing that in the past couple of years, this process for Ukraine has been accelerated, but at the same time, I think there will be there will be much more details involved here when it comes to what extent Ukraine meets the criteria to join the European Union.
And even those countries that are very much in favor of Ukraine's war effort against Russia, that have been supporting it militarily, like Poland, because of its agricultural lobby, they're extremely skeptical about Ukraine, an agricultural superpower joining the EU. I mean, I know that is a fact, and they might even try to stop that from happening, even in a fast-track way.
There is a lot of skepticism when it comes to the fast-tracking the membership for Ukraine, which has been, it has been heavily weakened as a result of this terrible war that has been happening for the past 4 years. And that has also stopped Ukraine to focus on some of the key criteria that EU asks for from any country that wants to join the European Union. So I think we will be seeing much more resistance from European allies in the future. But I think it is realistic if Zelensky and Ukrainian government would be willing to show the commitments that they are willing to cut off some of the crucial deficiencies. And we have been seeing scandals related to high-profile corruption deals and so on. So these would be taken into consideration, and Ukraine would be under heavy scrutiny when it comes to this.
Indeed, although the Ukrainians have pointed out, at least when there is corruption in Ukraine, people get fired. In Moscow, that is not necessarily the case, to put it mildly. Stay on the line, Natia. I want to bring in Anthony Gardner. He's the former US ambassador to the European Union. Anthony, it's good to have you back on the programme.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
And so when you read the National Security Strategy document written by the White House, and especially its attitude to the place that you used to be based in, Brussels and the European Union, do you think that this is, although using rather brazen language, a welcome wake-up call to the EU or an act of treachery from our closest friend?
It's an act of treachery from our closest friend. It's an obscene document, and it is contrary to 80 years of bipartisan U.S. foreign policy. Okay, I stress bipartisan because every one of my Republican predecessors in that job agreed now let's say 90%, on the proposition that it was in the U.S. Best interest to have a strong, united Europe around the EU. That was true from the Treaty of Rome onwards. So this document is amateurish, it is ignorant, and it is a slap in the face, because it really says the position now of the United States is to promote extreme movements in Europe, mostly, well, on the right wing, whose purpose it is to undermine the EU. That's extraordinary, and it is a complete departure of everything we've done.
So you were shocked. You were deeply shocked when you read this.
Yes, because it goes even further, well, much further than anything we saw in the first term. And shocked because there wasn't a word of criticism about Russia, not really a word of criticism about China. All the criticism about European allies. I mean, this is incredible.
It is extraordinary. And I mean, someone pointed out it could have been written by the Kremlin, and it was certainly applauded officially by the Kremlin. I just wonder, as a slightly more benign interpretation of what's going on, I'm just trying to get my head around this document. Do you think that especially Donald Trump sees the European Union with its 500 million plus consumers, with its markets, with its predilection for regulation, does he see it as a real competitor to the United States that needs to be dismantled in order to make the competition go away?
I think that is true, although he doesn't really take it very seriously. And we saw that play out in the recent US-EU trade deal, where, in fact, the EU caved. I mean, it is a very, very one-sided deal. The EU had tools at its disposal to respond, including the so-called anti-coercion instrument, which would have allowed it to take basically any action, including closing off its public procurement market, which, by the way, is a €1 trillion market. It could have taken a page out of China's book, which escalated against every measure that Donald Trump took, and then forced Donald Trump to de-escalate. It didn't do any of that. So, yes, you're right. But I think Donald Trump looks at the EU and says, well, basically, they're weak. Basically, they'll fold. And basically, yes, I can fragment and undermine the EU to my advantage.
What has the EU ever done to him to make him so angry against them? I mean, I know he's called them a scam, and they're trying to fleece America. I'm just wondering where this really visceral loathing of the European Union comes from.
Well, it does represent a lot of things that the MAGA movement really, really hate. And that is supranationalism, a desire to follow multinational rules, whether it's the world trading rules or otherwise. Those things are obviously anathema to MAGA. Clearly, he doesn't like the fact that the EU magnifies the influence of the member states, the 27 member states, in trade to get better terms, usually, right? He doesn't like that. Indeed, it's a commercial competitor. But it's not just commercial. I think it's the values for which the EU stands.
And do you think that this toothpaste, now that it's out of the tube, can be put back into the tube if we get a president who's not quite as viscerally opposed to the European Union?
Well, I like to think so. Look, I've been in U.S. politics for a while. I served under Clinton's White House. I think we will veer more to the center. I do fear, and quite rightly, that a lot of our allies are going to be very worried, that there could be another Trumpian, whether it's J.D. Vance or somebody down the line, and that trust is very hard to reestablish. Look, I lived through the Snowden, and its aftermath, and how difficult it was to restore trust and actually do things like a trade agreement, which we tried, and we failed, but we got pretty far down the path, and the data privacy agreement. But it took a lot of hard work. So reestablishing that trust will be really hard.
I want to get back to you, Natia, but one more question to you, Anthony. Do you think the European Union really needs to stand up more to Donald Trump? I mean, there's a lot of ring kissing going on at the moment. Mark Rutte called him daddy, and Trump made a joke about it. Trump famously hates people who behave like, sycophants. He wants people to stand up to him, which is not exactly what we're doing. Have the European leaders got this right in their approach, or should they be tougher?
Look, it's easy to say this, after the fact, and when you're not at the negotiating table, I admit, but the EU did not use its leverage. Look at what happened. I mentioned China beforehand, but not just China. Brazil, which is, not nearly as strong as China. Brazil actually was threatened by Donald Trump, and then finally the tariffs were actually taken away in almost every case, except for a few sectors. So other countries have actually stood up and say no, and actually, as you said, Donald Trump tends to like that. The EU believed that it was going to get the benefit of the bargain in getting Donald Trump to protect Europe and to protect Ukraine. Neither of those things are going to happen, by the way. And it believed that Donald Trump would stop attacking the EU's digital regulations, and that hasn't happened either.
Right. Natia, final question to you. The European Union, keeps talking about ramping up its arms production, is spending more money on defense, etc., etc. But we know that within this very fragmented arms industry, the French are whistling to their own tune. The Brits want to get in, but they have to pay a huge amount of money to do so. I mean, what does Europe need to do to actually punch at its defense weight?
I mean, I think the reality is that, and this is also demonstrated by the U.S. national security strategy, that they see Europe. They see that Europe. They basically command that Europe needs to take primary responsibility for its own defense. And I think there is a certain realization, a rather quite delayed one, but still within Europe, that this needs to happen. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of different restrictions and limitations that prevents Europe to be more efficient. This includes with regards to helping Ukraine, because I think if we are talking about sustaining Ukraine's war effort in case the peace deal fails, and I do believe that there is a high likelihood that this would be the case, Europe would be primarily responsible for providing Ukraine the necessary weapons, necessary logistics support, advisory support, and so on to sustain and to resist the Russian aggression against them. So in this case, I think Europe needs to think twofold. Firstly, to ensure that they ramp up their defense capabilities, and secondly, to ensure that they have enough resources to be able to sustain Ukraine's resistance.